So, welcome to my book channel, Scribbler. It's really funny how sometimes I start these things and then I say I'm not stopping because I'm doing this on my Mac on a photo booth, so there's no real editing, but I just discovered there is, and whatever. I don't know how to use it yet, and I'm still practicing. Anyways, I know nothing. So I got into reading, and I was 10 minutes into it, and I said something, and then all of a sudden, what's her name? Siri answers me, and I didn't even know she was on. I must have said something in which it kind of like activated her. I don't know. Anyways, I said something, and she replied by saying, "I don't know." I asked a question, and she answered it. I was like, wow, really? Right in the middle of it. It's like, frustrating or what? Anyways, I'm going to try and read this. Hopefully there won't be any more disturbances, because Siri interrupted at the same time that the recycling truck came in and was backing up with a little beeper going, and so that was loud, but I managed to, I think, maybe, I don't know, whatever, I canceled that. So, here we go. The Bashful Courtesan, Chapter 4, Vienna, 1914. Here we go. I spent all of the next week cleaning my studio. It wasn't as if it was a real hardship for me. I'd been paid for my last commission, something I told myself I could get used to, and hoped the money I'd earn would last at least a month, if not longer. If I could earn a living on a commission alone, I'd no longer have to sell my portraits in time. But those little portraits were how I'd won my commissions in the first place. I often took a handful of postcard-size samples with me as I painted in the streets, and as people stopped to sort through the samples while I painted, I asked if they were interested in buying a larger painting or perhaps sitting for a portrait. It was a slow and tedious process for many reasons, the first being I was never what you'd call a personable man. It's never been easy for me to speak to strangers at the best of times, and being forced to talk to someone is even more difficult. Having an excuse for not going out, and the comfort of knowing the Count had paid the rent in full for the next 6 months, or at the very least that I had my own money for the purchase of food, I was happy to put any extra time I had into cleaning my studio. It was too cold to set up my paints up in the streets, with the promise of snow looming heavy on the horizon. It came as no surprise to see how much room I had once I cleared everything out of the way and rearranged my paintings. I'd come across the studio quite by accident some years back. The previous owner had been little more than a casual acquaintance, a failed actor who turned his hand to managing a semi-successful theater company in the city's first district. He'd offer me use of the attic as a studio if I promised to design sets for his plays. It was a serendipitous arrangement that might have lasted years had it not been for the circumstances that brought about the financial ruin of the theater company, as well as my friend. The attic had been used as a storage area for the company's various costumes and props for over a dozen years before I came along. Finding space for me to work within the small confines of the room had not proven much of a challenge. It was after I had everything arranged when the banking crisis hit back in '09. My friend found himself financially ruined, and a theater company he'd so recently formed scattered because of his inability to meet his obligations. He was forced back on the stage, where he made a stunning comeback, only to die the following year of a massive heart attack, which left me in sole possession of the attic. His widow wanted nothing to do with the theater company. As long as I paid the rent to her lawyers monthly, I was told I'd be allowed to stay. I found myself in possession of whatever props there were, simply because the widow turned her back on everything. The props included a huge collection of costumes, wigs, and armor, along with velvet draperies I hung up as background curtains, a Chinese screen, several Turkish rugs, a divan, and the large metal bathtub I used for storing my paints and supplies. I would only clean the tub out if a client wanted to use it as a prop. For myself, I bathed once a week at the bathhouse around the corner, which was why I used the tub as a storage basin. It was more practical for me to bathe at the bathhouse as there was no running water in the studio. The thought of walking up and down 7 flights of stairs, carrying 2 buckets of water at a time, sounded exhausting. Over the years, I sold whatever props I could to help pay the rent. The last of the big things I sold was a large wooden chariot to the opera house, which was why the stage manager allowed me access backstage where I was free to paint as I pleased. The studio proved damnably hot in the summer and bracingly cold in the winter. The coal stove offered little warmth because of the overall enormity of the room. It was the main reason I placed my cot beside the stove. The room was no use to anyone else because of the low sloping ceiling. At its highest point, a full-grown man might stand up straight, but the slope of the ceiling left no room for him to move about comfortably, not without hitting his head on the ceiling beams above. As I cleaned, I pushed my cot away from the stove and against the farther wall, away from the door and into a small alcove I'd planned to use later as another storage space. It took a great effort on my part to hang a paint-splattered drop cloth off a line I strung across the opening. I had to stand on my painter's stool and use an old sabot to drive nails into the beams so I could hang a length of rope between the 2 walls. When I finished, I realized that even though I couldn't see behind the makeshift curtain, any normal-sized person would easily see over top. There was nothing I could do about it for the moment, I told myself, and left it in place. I dragged my easel and paint table to the other side of the room, beside the washstand and basin. This is where I placed the 2 wooden buckets I used for carrying my daily ration of water up from the fountain at the end of the street. Sitting them next to the washstand, I made certain the buckets were always full. I half carried and half dragged the Chinese screen across the room, but was prevented from moving it into place because of the makeshift curtain I'd made. The screen served as a blind for me to sit behind while I painted. I lined up the small opening I'd cut into the screen with the makeshift stage I'd erected across the room, and placed the divan close to the windows and under the skylight. I made a wooden frame that ran the full length of the stage from which I might hang the velvet draperies off as a background. Everything stood in the center of the room, using the room's maximum height and leaving the sightlines unobstructed. What little light there was sifted through a set of 3 large windows that were so old and the glass so coated with dirt and grime they offered little in the way of a view. Someone set a small window seat into the wall beside the sill of the middle window, and I'd often push the window open on hot summer nights when the heat was unbearable. I'd sit on the windowsill looking out over the city for what seemed like hours at a time, enjoying the breeze and watching the distant lights where they reflected off the river. The long shadows between the lights looking as if they might be pillars holding up the farther shore, the same way one would imagine Atlas holding the world on his shoulders. A series of 4 skylights in the ceiling let in a dull, opaque light that settled across the room like morning fog, receding like the tide by late afternoon. I paced off an open area thinking I might be able to lay the canvas out and work on it before I framed it, but decided that would be impractical. The space I had to work within was almost 16 meters square. Making and canvassing a painting that size would require a great deal of effort, as well as cost. I prepared for the Count's mistress by putting on the only clean smock I had. It had been a week since my initial meeting with George and the Count, and for once I thought things were going my way. The money for the portrait I'd completed the week before, and another commission already lined up, the Count's commission, was something I'd never had before. I considered myself lucky if I had a commission once every 3 months. Then there was George's promise to buy what he insisted on calling his painting. I thought maybe this winter I'd be able to keep warm. As I pulled the smock over my head, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I'd paused for a moment longer than I should have and looked at the hideous lump on my back while my skinny torso twisted off to one side like a corkscrew. I'd learned a long time ago and at great personal expense that no one can bear looking at me for too long before they show either contempt or loathing in their eyes. I pulled the smock down, settling it over my head and adjusting it so I could see properly, thinking how I looked like a child-sized ghost one sometimes saw on stage. A short time later, I heard the resonating thunder of an automobile rumbling through the streets and stopping below my window. The sound of its motor seemed to echo between the buildings as if it were a living, breathing beast. I thought to myself, if there were ever dragons in the world, they would have sounded like that. I ran to the window, pushing it open against the cold and feeling the vibration of the automobile's motor through my hand on the glass. It wasn't as if I'd never seen an automobile before. Since the turn of the new century, they'd become such a nuisance in the city. They were kept to the outer edges where they raced through the wider streets and boulevards of the old Ringstrasse. They were always in contention with street trams and horse-drawn trolleys, constantly darting in front of the trams or else upsetting passing horse carts. One seldom saw automobiles in the lesser districts of the city. The streets were too narrow, with barely enough room for dray horses and push carts. And yet, there it is, I thought. I looked down at the driver in the front seat, wearing an oversized wool-lined riding coat, his collar turned up against the brisk December wind, his face wrapped up with a muffler tied about his neck. He wore a pair of green-tinted touring goggles and a cap he took off as he stepped out to open the rear door where George sat in the back bench with a woman. I strained to get a better look at her, but she was bundled up in an oversized riding coat similar to the one George and the driver were wearing. She was also wearing a large oversized hat tied down with a scarf. I watched children from the surrounding buildings run out into the street, never having seen an automobile up close before. George leaped down from the back bench as the driver stepped aside, holding the door open while George took the woman's hand with a great show of manners and helped her step down from the automobile. It required quite the effort on her part to negotiate the last step because of the tight-fitting dress she had on. George took off his oversized coat and goggles, tossing them onto the driver's back bench before picking up his derby and brushing it clean with his sleeve. He helped the woman shed her outside coat as if she were shedding her skin, and then reached into the automobile and picked up a fur wrap he wound about her thin shoulders. I saw her laugh as he spoke into her ear before reaching into the automobile for her muff. The driver was quick to pick up the riding coats and carry them to the back of the automobile, where he deposited them into a large storage trunk, not unlike a steamer trunk, tied down with brass and leather straps, the buckles reflecting the morning light. I leaned out of the window, hoping I might get a better look at the woman, but couldn't see anything because of the oversized hat she wore and her fur wrap. George picked up what appeared to be a thin walking stick and took her arm as the driver climbed back into the front seat, letting out a loud wail with the horn, warning the children away from the automobile. I watched, fascinated, as the man inched his way through the bustling crowd of children. In no time at all, the automobile was hurtling down the road with a small corkscrew of exhaust and dust trailing behind. It was only a moment before I heard a soft, insistent tap, sounding much like a pizzicato passage pecking at my door. I waddled to the door, feeling nervous as I adjusted the smock one last time. I opened the door, looking up at George as he prepared to tap one more time with what looked to be an unstrung violin bow. Dressed in a simple suit of dark worsted wool, George was quick to remove his hat as he slowly peeled his gloves off. He remembered to duck his head at the last moment as he stepped in through the door. His hair was loose, hanging on his shoulders, and his cheeks red from the cold ride in the open automobile. "You do like to make an entrance," I said with a laugh. "What, that?" Novak offered to lend me his automobile and its driver for the afternoon. "Do you know they call him an automobilist? How insane is that? If the man were as if the man were a specialist of some sort, simply because he knows how to do something like drive an automobile. Anyway, how could I say no? "Where's my model?" I asked. "I saw her getting out of that thing with you." "It's called an automobile. It's a Daimler, if you must know, and it's the way of the future, so you'd better get used to it." "The future? If that's the future, we're in for a lot of trouble," I said with another light laugh, realizing I was strangely nervous. "I would have taken you for a more progressive Mantochevsky." "Why would you say something like that?" The size of the thing makes it impractical in a city like this. You wouldn't be able to drive two of them side by side on this street, or any other for that matter. You'd have to make special roads for them. They've been around since the turn of the century, and they are building roads, I'll have you know, and using the existing lanes. That was the moment Anna Davadova poked her head around the corner of the door. At first appearance, she was a tiny, diminutive girl, all wrapped up in fur as she was, the perfect picture of a modernist as far as fashion was concerned, I'm sure. She was dressed in a coral blue colonial dress with black velvet trim hugging her slender hips and thighs, as well as a tight waistcoat accentuating an ample bosom. Beneath the waistcoat was a cream blouse made of raw silk. She wasn't as young as I'd first assumed. The tiny lines etched around her eyes and mouth were like fine cracks one might find on a porcelain doll. Everything about her spoke of youth and vibrancy except her eyes. There was a hardness in them that had borne witness to the sands of time. George saw me staring and turned around. "Anna, come in," George laughed, stepping out of the way and holding his hand out to her. "Mind you don't bump your head," he warned her. She took his hand and stepped in through the door, into my world and into my heart, the pheasant feather on her hat brushing the ceiling beam as she took off the fur wrap. She untied the large hat, pulling out 3 large pins and holding both the wrap and hat close to her chest as if deciding whether or not to give them up. All the while, I could see her looking about the room with a critical eye. I stood in silent absorption, watching as she stepped around me with a pleasant smile. All I could think of was how relieved I was at having cleaned the room. She smelled of fresh talcum and soft perfume which clung to her like an aura as she turned around, taking in the entire room. "Oh, George, you were right. It is quaint. And this must be him, then, the dwarf. Such a curious little man," she said with a pleasant smile as she looked me up and down. I felt a part of me dissolve at the sound of her voice, thinking her the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, likely to ever see. She could have said anything to me, and I would have melted with every word. Her hair was a tangled mass of ringlets and curls, framing her face with a coppery hue of auburn. She had large, violet-colored eyes that appeared as deep and endless as the morning sky. I thought a man might willingly let himself get lost within the depths of those eyes. Her complexion was that of a young girl rather than a cosmopolitan woman, and there was just the right hint of rouge. I told myself she must have applied it while outside waiting for the door. Her lips were large, full, and sensuous, and her nose was perfect, straight, and unblemished. She stepped into the studio with a nimbus of distinction as George took the wrap and hat she gave him, hanging them on a nail beside the door. "How long will this take?" George asked, looking at his pocket watch as he stepped into the center of the room. He fished a cigarette out of his silver case he took out of his breast pocket, tapped it down briefly before lighting it and offering me one as an afterthought. "Not too long, I hope," Anna said, looking at the sparse surroundings before finally stepping up to the raised platform where the divan waited for her. I felt embarrassed that I didn't have more to offer her. I should have made a pot of coffee, I told myself. She might have appreciated the effort. She pounded the divan with a gloved hand, and I watched as dust motes danced in the dull light slipping in through the dirty skylights. She pulled her gloves off and laid them on the divan carefully. "Can you help me?" I asked George. I hadn't been able to pull the Chinese screen completely into place because of the paint-splattered curtain I'd hung up, and George was kind enough to help. When I had the screen where I wanted it, I put my stool behind it and moved my easel into place, dragging the large rolling work table where I kept my pencils, charcoals, and watercolors closer. When I was ready, I climbed up on the stool and looked through the hole in the screen. I had a clean pad of paper on the easel in front of me. I looked at George as he watched me with a mixture of curiosity and interest, and said, "I'm sorry, I don't have another stool for you to sit on." "That's all right. I have a rehearsal to attend, and I'm off for luncheon with Novak," he explained. He stood behind me, watching my first preliminary sketches. He bent over my shoulder, looking through the hole in the screen, seeing how it framed the divan and sparse surroundings, Lunch? Anna asked with a laugh as she perched herself on the edge of the divan. Yes, George nodded, distracted as he straightened up again. Ingenious, he said to me, then looked up at Anna. Novak didn't mention it to you, he asked. Lunch? Yes, he did, she smiled. You, his wife, and her sister, she said with a smile. It's my fee for acting as his second, so to speak, George confessed. He says you're fixated on his sister-in-law, she smiled at him. Is that true? Are you, George? Fixated, I mean. Fixated? I wouldn't say that. I adore her, sure, but I adore all women, don't I? He added. So I've heard, she laughed, and not just a few times either. I suppose, like any other man, you adore some women more than others, she added with a teasing smile, punctuating it with another quick laugh. Some might say it's an obsession, George. I'm sure the Count's sister-in-law does. George grinned, pulling his watch out again and checking the time. I'd give up womanizing forever if I could have just one night with her, Anna. But I doubt if she's even noticed me. I doubt that very much, but just one night? I'm sure her husband might have something to say about that, don't you? She smiled. What does that mean? Do you know something I don't? Has Novak said something to her about me? He added, snapping his watch case shut and looking at her. And which question do you expect me to answer first? Let me see. She paused as if trying to remember exactly what he'd said. It means that you're a handsome man in your own way, so it's not likely she hasn't noticed you. And what do you mean by in my own way? George, I haven't finished answering your first question yet. The answer to your second question is no, and your third question is no as well. The Count hasn't said anything about you to her, at least not that I know of. You still haven't told me what that's supposed to mean. The part about me being handsome in my own way. Exactly what I said. Everyone has their own redeeming qualities, George. You know that. Some people have qualities that others find quite attractive, while others are totally repulsed. I don't think I can say it any more simple than that. You're right. I don't think you can either, he said with a laugh. And there you have it. Indeed. How much time do you need? George asked, turning his attention back to me. Wow, you've done that already? He asked. I had 6 quick sketches. Eyes, hair, hands, neck, mouth, and shoulders. Studies, if you will. As much as a composer might write etudes for his students to practice. It's something I've always done. As much as a person's eyes might convey feelings, there's just as much expression in the way a person holds their hands or drops their shoulder when they speak or laugh. What does Frau Davadova have to say about it? I asked, but George seemed distracted by what he saw. The time, George, the time, I reminded him, noticing how preoccupied he appeared with the sketches. Do you mind if I call you George? Oh, yes, the time. Anna, how much time do you have to spare? George asked, looking at her briefly before turning to look at me again. Mind? Why would I mind? Of course you can call me George. I told you I'm going to make you a rich man. How much time do I have? She asked, with what could only be called a bemused smile. I don't know. My afternoon is free. Why, what's he done so far? Just the usual studies, I said, looking up at George. Nothing serious, I called out to her. Obviously, this is something that can't be done in a day, George said. There was an evenness in his voice. No, I agreed. I don't have to be anywhere until tonight, when I'll be seeing the Count. Living the life of a kept woman, are you? George laughed. I think a few hours will be more than enough time for you to have lunch, Anna said, forcing an uncomfortable smile. Why don't you come by and get me when you're done? Shall we say 4 o'clock? Perfect, George said, walking himself to the door. As he pulled his gloves on, he paused. Oh, yes, before I forget, he said to me, his hand on the doorknob. Novak says you have complete artistic freedom. I like that, but he also mentioned that you'd take care of whatever supplies I needed, if memory serves me correctly, I answered. Did he? I don't remember that part of the deal, but it sounds like something he'd say, doesn't it? George said, opening the door with a laugh. I'll try to be back by 4, he added, closing the door behind him softly. Now, Anna said as George left, is it locked? Why don't you check and make sure? There was an old padlock that once hung on the outside of the door, but I'd removed it and placed it on the inside years ago. It was for my own safety, I told myself, and believed it. I was thinking if some enterprising young thief should suddenly discover that my work was valuable, or if a client be proved dissatisfied with my work, I'd be safe. As I said, I actually believed it. I snapped the padlock into place and returned to the security of my screen, where I took off my smock. Something I discovered years ago is that it's easier to paint when you're not restricted in your movements. While the smock may have provided me with the anonymity I required, it did little to help as far as my work was concerned. As long as I remained behind the screen, I'd be afforded that anonymity, and I needed to feel safe. What harm could it do, I asked myself, as long as my smock was hanging nearby? Anna stood up almost as soon as I'd climbed back onto my stool, and I turned to look at her, startled by her sudden movement. She smiled as she removed her waistcoat and undid her skirt in the back, letting it drop to the floor in a heap. Next, she undid her silk blouse, kicking it aside and standing before me in what I later learned was a French skirt and bustier as she spread her clothes on the divan. What are you doing?" I stammered. "I want this to be special," she said with a smile, and sitting down, pulled the strings of her bustier. With the bustier undone and only partly open, she lay back on top of her clothes, comfortable in her near-nakedness, as she casually threw an arm behind her head in a near-classic pose. "I don't think the Count wants a complete nude," she said, "and to be quite honest, neither do I," she added, "at least not yet. Let's wait and see how this goes first. I think it's better this way. With the screen in front of me, it's almost like being at confession. I'm more comfortable here than I've ever felt with other men I've posed for. Then again, a girl has to make a living, doesn't she?" She smiled. "Does it surprise you hearing me say that?" I was silent. When I didn't speak, she approached the screen. Looking over the makeshift curtain, she saw me seated with my face buried in my hands, weeping. As the tears streamed down my face, I forced myself to look up, sensing her, embarrassed that she should see me weeping. I tried to turn away from her. I tried to jump off my stool and grab my smock, but being upset, I fumbled with it and was only partially able to cover myself. I felt as if she'd caught me out, that she'd found me doing something I shouldn't have been doing. I doubted very much if she understood how I felt. Even Melly the whore, after having asked her to pose for me, ridiculed me whenever she saw me approaching in the streets. I'd never painted a woman naked because it was something she'd wanted, and I knew to look at her she'd never understand the difference. I looked up, trying to force a smile. I tried throwing the smock over my twisted form again in a vain effort to hide from her, feeling as if I were the one standing half naked in the room and not her. "You poor little man," she intimated, coming around the blind and bending down to comfort me. "I'm sorry. I had no idea you'd feel this way. Do you want me to leave?" "You don't have to do this if you're not up to it." I shook my head as she put her arms around me, pulling me and holding me close to her. I melted against the nearness of her flesh, the very scent of her wrapping me tight. I let the smock fall to the floor and slowly slipped my arms around her with some semblance of hesitation, the wall of uncertainty I'd cast up in front of me seeming to collapse under the weight of my pounding heart. I felt tears welling up in my eyes and told myself I was in need of compassion as much as the next man. I doubt if anyone has ever looked at me and seen the man hidden within me before. When people look at me, they see me as a monster and nothing more. How my mother's heart must have broken as she gave birth to me, I thought, and felt more tears coming to my eyes as Anna held me tighter, stroking the top of my head and shushing me as if she were a mother holding an injured child. "It's a remarkable likeness all the same," George said through a cloud of lingering blue smoke. I watched, transfixed, as the smoke meandered its way up to the ceiling, thinking if I could only find a way to copy that exact color. He saw me looking at the cigarette and flicked the ashes on the floor. He looked at me with a half smile and gave a quick shrug. I had no intention of letting him see the sketches, but Anna insisted. "Do you like them?" she asked as I stood by, adjusting my smock. "I do," George burst out quickly. Too quickly, I thought, and it made me wonder. But, I do. Honestly, I do," he said, turning to look at me and then Anna. "It's probably the only time I'll ever get to see you naked," he said with that half smile. "And that's the problem, isn't it? What's Novak going to say when he sees you, tits hanging out, and then looks at our little friend here? You know how hot-headed his kind can be. It's almost as if it's bred into them. They're just water sketches, I said, balking at the idea of that man angry at me because I saw his mistress naked. He doesn't have to know. Do you want me to hide them? Okay, they're hidden, just like that. But you heard him say I had complete artistic freedom, I explained, and threw the drop cloth back over the easel. I'd like to believe that art washes away the anger of the unimpaired, but having met the man just once, I find myself somewhat underwhelmed. There was a moment when no one spoke. I just don't know where to go from here, though, I said, purposely steering the conversation away from the possible repercussions due to the Count being a jealous man. I decided to plunge ahead. The subject, I need a theme. A theme, George asked. An empty canvas is an amazing wonder because it lays a world of possibilities at your feet. It's only through art that we can see ourselves as someone else sees us. That's why a theme is so important. What kind of a theme? 7 deadly sins of some sort? Man's inhumanity to man? Something you feel the Count will understand? Yes. Accept the nudity as part of the story. Joan of Arc. She didn't lead the French army en scenes nues. You're thinking of that woman leading the marches in Paris, the 1848 revolution? That's the one. You know it, he asked, surprised. In Petrograd. And what's that theme? Patriotism? Naked patriotism. Man's inhumanity to man, of course. But a nude, Anna? George asked, butting his cigarette on the floor before turning to look at her. That's what all the good mistresses are giving their lovers, she replied. I'm sure they meant to say they're keepers, don't you? It's only a partial nude, I was quick to point out. Because it's what Anna wants, I said. Anna might be the one paying for it, but don't you think anyone's gonna remember his name in 100 years? Depending on the subject, Anna could be remembered forever. Today, with photographs and the cinema, there's no knowing what the future might hold for her, but do you honestly think I'd be able to talk any woman into posing nude for me? But you have nudes. I've seen them, he said, and turned to look at me. Yes, I admitted freely. French postcards. Simple black and white photographs that leave little to the imagination, I'm afraid, but I'm after a fleeting moment, not something frozen in time. Only one of those paintings was a real woman. The rest were postcards. I paid handsomely for her to pose, substantially more than she was worth, if you ask me. To be perfectly honest, she was a common whore, a less than common strumpet. She charged me more for her time than she would have charged me had I been one of the men she beds. I had no choice but to pay what she demanded. She's given up a lot of income, or potential income, taking herself out of the game, Anna said gently. Besides, doesn't matter what the Count thinks, Anna said, flashing George one of her flawless smiles. It's the perfect gift all the same. I say, damn the consequences if he doesn't like it. Then we can buy it for me. Wouldn't I be what you'd call a consequence, I offered. The perfect gift, George laughed, ignoring me. A nude painting of his mistress is the perfect gift for a man. Where do you think he'll hang it? I've seen the wall he wants to mount it on, and believe me, he won't be putting his naked mistress up there for his children to see every day. Don't you think the Countess might have something to say about it? Anastasia's different from most women when it comes to decorating her house. She's very controlling. If you want a nude, it can't be something as ordinary as a portrait, not for the size he wants. Does it embarrass you seeing me like that? She asked, that playful smile still on her lips. Hers is a smile that would be easy to capture on canvas, I thought. Embarrass me? Of course not, George said defensively, and lifted the drop-cloth up to look at my sketches. She laughed harder. I hope not, considering where you and the Count found me. How was lunch, by the way? Lunch? With the Count. Did you forget, or were you so caught up in your violin class you forgot about it? No, I went, he said, and turned away from the easel to retrieve her wrap and hat from the nail on the wall. It was good, and it's called a rehearsal, not a class. If you say so. I do. That's all you have to say? It was good? What do you want me to say? He asked, holding her wrap up for her. I want you to say that she threw herself at your feet and fell madly in love with you. She's married. That she threw her husband aside for you then. He's a diplomat. And you're a concert violinist. Isn't that why you went there in the first place? I'll bet you I'll bet you hoped once she saw you, she'd leave her husband for you, she said, laughing as she stood up. I'd be a fool not to, but she brought her son with her. And she couldn't really pay attention to me, could she? She has a son? She is married, he reminded her. And where's that bounder of a diplomat husband, she asked, taking her hat and fixing it in place with pins and no mirror. London. He's part of the delegation working out a treaty for the Balkans. Well, he was until another war broke out. Now I suppose he's just sitting around a card table playing whist with the Turks, George added in an offhand way. I wasn't really listening to her. All I heard was that he was out of the country. I suppose there'll be another year or so, and when he gets home, he'll have to turn around and start all over, because by then there'll be another war. Maybe he'll get killed. I doubt it, George laughed. He's a diplomat, not a soldier. And how was the Count? She asked, stopping at the window and looking at her reflection. She tucked a few loose strands of hair back into place as she adjusted her hat. Novak? He asked, his usual self, inattentive. I really don't understand what you see in the man. You could do so much better. Now, don't start with that again, George. He's the Count and has lots of money, which you'll never see as long as he pays attention to me. What do I care? She asked, turning around to face him. You can lust after me all you want, but what can you offer me? At my age, I need stability. You mean as long as he pays for that apartment you have and your furs and buys you jewels? Exactly, she smiled. I'm not looking at forever, just for a while. You're a vixen, Anna. Is that a bad thing? My mother always told me a girl has to look out for herself, she replied, grinning. Now, why don't you be a dear and take me home so we can talk more about this girl you're so obsessed with? Why not? George shrugged. She thinks I'm seeing you anyways. What? Who does? She seemed surprised and stopped to look up at him. Explain yourself? Novak told his wife I was seeing you. He did he? She smiled, and then turning, looked at me. I'm ever so grateful. Can I call back tomorrow? I'm counting on it, I said, wishing she could see the smile I stood behind. And there you go. That was chapter 4 in its entirety. I like reading it like that because it's better than just hanging around and, a part little here and a part little there, a little part here, a little part there, everywhere, a little part. I don't like doing that. That's what I've been doing with my Substack stories. I think my chapters need to be read in their entirety. That way, it sounds better, I think. The story makes it better. Anyways, so that was Jodie Foster reading. How did I sound? I got the same haircut almost. She does look good, though. I saw her at the Academy Awards because, yeah, we did watch it, and she looked good. Anyways, I'm going to leave it at that, and we will be back. I'll be putting this out, I think, let's go Thursday. Yeah, I think Thursday is the day that we should be doing it. I've got 4 pieces out so far on my Scribbler BookTube channel. I've got, I think, 97 views. I have 5 subscribers. Can you imagine? I have 5 subscribers. That's funny. Anyways, there you go. And I'm going to let it go at this. And this time, I'm really going to turn it off properly. Okay? So, next week, same bat time, same bat channel. Adios.